Welcome back, everybody, to the fourth keynote in our conference, Theology, Aging and the Life of the Church. Let me introduce myself first of all. I'm Peter Scott, as I hope is clear from my Zoom handle, and I teach in the Department of Religions and Theology at the University of Manchester. And so I'm representing the fourth institution in this quartet of institutions who are staging this conference over these couple of days. And it's my very great pleasure to introduce our fourth speaker, Dr. Michael Mawson. And Mike is Senior Lecturer in Systematic Theology and Ethics at United Theological College and Charles Sturt University. And so is joining us this morning from Australia. Previously, he was lecturer at the University of Aberdeen. And it was in that connection, I think, Mike, that you and I first met, because we first met at one of the meetings of the annual conference of the Society for the Study of Christian Ethics. Anyway, that's as I recall it.
That's right.
That's as I recall it anyway. But let me just carry on with the introduction. Mike has a range of research interests, and he's published certainly in the scholarly study of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So in 2018, Oxford University Press brought out his Christ Existing as Community, Bonhoeffer's Ecclesiology, and he's also made a contribution to the secondary scholarship on Bonhoeffer through editing a number of works, not least the Oxford Handbook of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, which came out in 2019, as I recall. But he also has research interests in the theology of aging. Indeed, he's writing a book on the theology of aging at the present time. And last year, he gave a paper at a conference hosted by the McDonald Centre at Oxford on the theme also of aging. So it's a very great pleasure to welcome you to formally, Mike, to the conference, and to say we're looking forward very much to hearing what you have to say. I'm just consulting with Professor Google now, and it tells me that the time with you is 21:34. So thank you for being with us out of your evening, and for those of us in the kind of European time zone speaking to us in our morning. As I understand it, the title of your paper is Aging, Theology and the Cross. Lovely to have you with us. The virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Peter. And greetings, everyone. And just to say, it's wonderful to be part of this event, and I've enjoyed the other lectures and the bits and pieces I've managed to catch. Let me just... Can you see the PowerPoint okay? Okay, excellent. So I guess a month or so ago, one of the organisers was chasing me for a title, and at that point I wasn't quite sure what I was going to present on. I thought if I just put aging and theology, it might be a bit too generic, so I gave him the title Aging, Theology and the Cross. And now that I know what I'm actually doing, I've filled that out a little more with a subtitle, Insights from Disability Theology for Approaching Aging. I do have a sort of scripted lecture, and I'm going to stay fairly close to that. I think just given the time difference, if I try and ad-lib too much, I may drift off to the side. But I'm very happy to clarify or discuss any of the points further when we get to the questions at the end. So there are clear and deep connections between aging and disability. Our chances of experiencing some level of physical or cognitive impairment increase significantly as we age and enter the final stages of life. So in Australia, where I'm based, it's estimated that 78% of men and 80% of women over the age of 80 experience some level of disability. And of course, the chances of experiencing disability are only going to increase from this point on. If disability has aptly been described as an open minority, that is a minority group or identity that any one of us might join, then given sufficient time and assuming that we live long enough, almost all of us here will find ourselves within this group. It might seem surprising then that the main ways we understand and respond to ageing and its effects have proceeded largely in isolation from work being done in disability studies and disability theology. So our main cultural scripts for understanding and negotiating ageing, I'll be arguing tonight or this morning, are instead provided and represented by the disciplines of medicine and gerontology. And these disciplines have clearly made important positive contributions to mitigating some of the worst effects of ageing at the individual and collective level. And I by no means wish to deny that. But the concern I'm going to raise is that they do so in ways that subtly construe ageing and its effects as inherently problematic, a problem to be negotiated and overcome, or at least that they tend in that direction. By contrast, disability studies and disability theology have given significant and sustained attention to the ways in which bodily impairment relates to what it means to be human. And indeed, one of the main claims of disability studies is precisely that experiences of disability are constitutive for identity. And recent disability theologians have attended to how bodily limits and vulnerabilities can inform identity and deepen relationships. And in particular, work in this area has often contested the construal of bodily limits or disabilities in terms of deficiency or abnormality. That is, bodily limits or impairments is something inherently limiting or problematic. So that's largely what I'm going to be covering. In the lecture, my interest is in how insights from disability theology can contribute to better ways of thinking about and attending to ageing, to our own ageing and decline, and to that of those we love. In the first part of the lecture, I'll outline two of our dominant contemporary scripts for approaching ageing, as found in or represented by modern medicine and gerontology. And I'll also outline what I take to be some of the limitations and potential problems with how these scripts operate. And then in the second part of the lecture, I'll put those aside and turn to some recent work in disability theology, or fairly recent work, and I'll suggest how some of these insights from this body of work can help to supplement and correct the dominant ways that we understand ageing. So put differently, how can disability theology help us to recognise and draw out some more complex meanings of ageing and decline? Okay. So let's start with the question, what is ageing? Or what are we even talking about here? So at one level, ageing, or the term ageing, simply names a series of structural and functional changes and processes that all biological beings undergo. And as biological beings, human beings are subject to the same laws of entropy and decay as other forms of life. So in the Handbook of Biology, of the Biology of Aging, the biologist Stephen Sturt defines aging as, quote, a process of intrinsic, progressive, and generalized physical deterioration that occurs over time, beginning at about the age of reproductive maturity. So that's one way we might answer this question, what is aging? Stepping back a little further, we might approach and understand these processes of ageing in evolutionary terms. So why does biological deterioration begin to occur at about the time of reproductive maturity? So evolutionary processes have a clear invested interest in keeping us alive, up until the point where we can pass on our genetic material. Beyond this, however, we become largely disposable and dispensable, at least in evolutionary terms. Evolution has no stake in preventing aging or eliminating illnesses and diseases that we encounter after we've reproduced. And if anything, it's useful for human beings to age, to deteriorate, and to die in order to make room for a new generation. So that's another way we might answer the question, what is aging, or why do we age? Closer to the ground, the term aging is used in describing a particular set of experiences and realities surrounding human life in its later stages. And our experiences of aging are surrounded and impacted by a set of complex and interrelated physical, cognitive, and environmental factors. And it's primarily aging in this sense, how we experience ourselves and others as aging beings, and how we organise and respond to this experience. It's aging in this sense that I'll be concentrating on here. How do we understand and negotiate human aging in the specific ways that we encounter and experience it? What are the scripts or discourses that we have at our disposal to assist us in making sense of our aging? And here, I'd simply suggest that two of our basic or most familiar scripts are present in the disciplines of medicine and gerontology. So I'm not simply interested in these disciplines as providing scientific and sociological research. I'm more interested in how they operate at a discursive level. Put differently, the ways in which they help us to organise and make sense of the ways we think about aging. You know, how are medicine and gerontology providing language, providing frameworks that help us to understand what aging as such is. Okay, so let's begin with the first of these two scripts, medicine. So broadly, modern medicine can be characterised by its pursuit of the reduction of suffering, to relieve the human condition, as Francis Bacon put it. This is what medicine's all about. Modern medicine is governed by an imperative to overcome illness and disease. And with respect to aging, this plays out in an ongoing attempt to ameliorate and mitigate the effects of bodily and cognitive decline. So insofar as possible, medical research and practice aim to reduce and manage the bodily and cognitive effects of aging. Within medicine more broadly, the specialisation that focuses on the complex medical needs of aging and older persons is, of course, geriatric medicine or geriatrics. And the work of a geriatrician is to act as a primary care doctor for older adults, responding to the numerous problems that emerge in the final decade or two. And this often involves discerning and maintaining a thin line between normal aging and age-related disease, or abnormal aging. And then helping to coordinate the range of services, treatments, and medications that older persons will require. Despite the care and services, often very good care and services provided by geriatricians, much of the treatment of older patients is undertaken by doctors without a specialised training. In most hospitals, older patients will receive much of their care and treatment in non-geriatric wards. And this is in part due to the ever-increasing specialisation of medical subdisciplines, and in part due to financial and legal pressures on hospitals and health systems, and perhaps even more so in the midst of our current crisis. So one result is that older persons will often find themselves within the same diagnostic tracks and receiving the same kinds of treatment as the general population. A person in her 80s experiencing acute cardiovascular problems, for example, may well receive the same recommendations and treatments as someone with heart problems in her 40s or 50s. This is certainly not always the case, but there's something that presses in that direction. The same kinds of interventions will often be advocated and pursued in either case. And when this does happen, this is because aging and aging as such fall outside the purview of what's deemed medically relevant. It's screened off when the particular condition is moved to front and centre. So put simply, and just to make this a bit more concrete with some examples, medical responses to age-related illness and disease often tend towards treatment and intervention. And here we might think of the acclaimed memoir by Atul Gawande, Being Mortal, Medicine and What Matters in the End, which came out in 2014. The simple view Gawande summarises is that medicine exists to fight death and disease, and that, of course, is its most basic task. So once the effects of ageing are understood within a medical framework, or a framework that exists to fight death and disease, then ageing and its effects are implicitly framed as something to be fought and overcome. And this framing and approach is not without its dangers. And Gawande's memoir demonstrates this in poignant detail. And he sort of tells a number of stories about the inability of doctors to advise against continual medical interventions, even as the effects on older patients begin to outweigh any tangible or realistic benefits. As mentioned above, medicine by definition is concerned with overcoming all illness and disease. And this means, as Sharon Kaufman has written elsewhere, work in geriatric medicine is orientated by the management and reduction of ageing and its effects, whether by monitoring health, by making direct medical interventions, or through palliative care. Just to take a different kind of example, the effects of approaching ageing from within a medical framework are evident in this way in which ageing is sometimes itself construed as a disease. So according to this line of thinking, ageing is something that we can and should strive to overcome directly. We should try and just cure ageing. And accordingly, the emergent field of biomedical gerontology is concerned with the basic biological mechanisms underlying ageing, as well as with technologies or therapies for preventing, arresting, and potentially reversing ageing processes. And this is big business. We might think of some of the massive biotech companies, Geron Corporation, Osiris Therapeutics, and others whose prime directive is research into overcoming ageing or solving the problem of ageing. And this is a multi-billion-dollar industry, much of it based in the US and around California and Silicon Valley. We might also think of more mainstream research into understanding and preventing ageing. And as an example here, we've got the Harvard geneticist David Sinclair in his recent book, Lifespan, Why We Age and Why We Don't Have to. Why We Age and Why We Don't Have to. And in the book, Sinclair surveys the most promising research and discoveries with the potential for reversing ageing and extending the human lifespan. And this includes successful experiments on mice that have managed to restore health and youth, most recently by administering NAD+ boosters to simulate serotonin and proteins which play a role in regulating aging. And more broadly, there's been a significant and increasing level of financial and scientific investment into solving the problem of aging as such. Why simply respond to the symptoms or the secondary effects when we might begin to address the underlying cause? Okay, let me turn to a second script. If medicine provides one of our basic scripts or frameworks for understanding and responding to aging, I'd suggest that the discipline of gerontology provides or represents another. So gerontology involves the study of the social and societal factors that impact our experiences of old age and aging. As a discipline, it has its origins in the need to find solutions to the challenges of aging populations. So emerging in the late 1970s, or at least consolidating in the late 1970s, it's expanded almost exponentially as these challenges have become ever more pressing. How do we develop policies and strategies that can minimize the burdens of aging, both for individuals and for wider societies? As more people are living for longer, how can we ensure the right kinds of conditions and social structures to support the aging and elderly? In this wider context, much of the work and research of gerontology has sought to pursue and promote successful aging. So in their now classic book from the late 1990s, John Rowe and Robert Kahn provide a threefold definition of what successful aging entails. Number one, living free of disability and disease. So number two, a high level of cognitive and physical function. Number three, sustained engagement in social and productive activities. So these are the criteria for aging successfully, or this is what it means to have success in your aging. Furthermore, Rowe and Kahn express a high degree of confidence that we can all age successfully with the right kinds of personal choices and societal and institutional supports. So through careful lifestyle choices, a healthy diet, exercise, good relationships, a positive outlook, and so forth, and with the right kinds of infrastructure, we can expect to remain productive and to avoid, or at least to significantly reduce, age-related disability and decline. In the decades since Rowe and Kahn's landmark work, pursuing successful aging has become not only central to gerontology as an academic discipline, it's become a cultural obsession more broadly. And to illustrate this, a little while ago, I decided to type the term aging into Amazon and see what titles came out on top of the list. So adopting this rigorous academic and scientific methodology, here are 5 of the book titles that were near the top. Wendy Owen, Aging Reversed, How We Age and How to Stay Younger for Longer. Patrick Hoford and Jill Hines, The 10 Secrets of Healthy Aging, How to Live Longer, Look Younger and Feel Great. Susie Grant, Alternative Aging, How to Stay Looking and Feeling Younger for Longer. Another book, Kate Marie and Merlin Thomas, Fast Living, Slow Aging, How to Age Less, Look Great, Live Longer, Get More. And then my personal favourite, which I've got on the screen here, From Aging to Saging, A Profound Vision of Growing Older, by Shalomi and Miller. So these and other such guides are replete with language of flourishing, thriving, wisdom and growth. And with Rowe and Kahn, they all express a high level of hope and confidence that with the right kinds of attitudes and practices, we can keep aging and its effects in check. If we buy these books, if we follow their advice, then we too can be successful in our aging. So what are we to make of this pursuit of successful aging in and beyond gerontology? So in his 2015 book, Loving Old Age and Ethics of Aging, the Dutch ethicist Frits de Lange makes an insightful observation. The successful aging strategy has been quite successful in the developed world during recent decades. More people than ever in Western countries live a healthy and active life in their 60s and 70s, sometimes into their 80s and 90s. This is good news. But what about the prospects in those residual 20 and 25 more or less unhealthy years of a lifespan? So for de Lange, there's a problem with what this pursuit of successful aging subtly ignores or at least downplays. In the end, aging and its effects will disrupt and overtake even our best attempts at success. And as another commentator more bleakly puts it, our trajectory towards death will be gradual but unrelenting, with steady decline, enfeeblement, and growing dependency, often lasting a decade or longer. In addition, we might be tempted to raise suspicions with what's underlying and driving this pursuit of successful aging. Again, in gerontology, but also perhaps even more so in our wider culture. And here, Christopher Hamilton, who's based at King's College in London, provides some helpful insight. No doubt much of the contemporary discussion of successful aging on the part of those who write about the old is well meant, and it's possibly helpful to them in various ways. It's possibly helpful to them in various ways, but it also, I think, serves an unavowed larger cultural purpose of hiding from those younger the reality of their own condition. So the pursuit of successful aging seems to be at least partly driven by a cultural avoidance of the messy, complex realities that accompany human aging and decline. We cling to the hope that we will age successfully, at least in part, in order to avoid confronting the fact that our experience, at least in the final stages, is likely to be otherwise. Okay, so what's my point? And just to sort of close off this first section, the disciplines of modern medicine and gerontology significantly proceed as attempts to manage and reduce aging and bodily decline, which certainly has many benefits. In so doing, however, they subtly construe aging and its effects as inherently, or at least primarily, problems. And while this construal has helped facilitate a number of important developments and advances, my concern is that it may neglect and obfuscate the sense in which aging and decline are inevitable and also basic to what we as human beings are. Put differently, my concern is that these scripts or disciplines neglect, or at least downplay, our experiences of aging and decline and all their complexity and messiness are integral to what we are as embodied human beings. Aging and its effects are not simply problems to be overcome and managed. At the same time, they're also integral to who and what we are, to how we experience the world and our relationships to one another. And that's what I now want to turn to in the second part of my lecture. So in this second section, my interest is in how disability studies and disability theology in particular can assist with supplementing and even correcting some of these tendencies in our standard stories or our standard disciplinary approaches to aging. In recent work in disability studies and disability theology has provided nuanced and rich reflections on how bodily limits and vulnerabilities are integrally related to personal and social identity. So just to take one example of this, we might look at in many ways, the founder of modern disability theology, Nancy Iceland, who is based in the US. And she once asserted that she hoped she would still have her disability in heaven. Despite her debilitating conditions and a series of painful operations, she felt that without her disability, she would, quote, be absolutely unknown to myself and perhaps to God. So Iceland's point is that her identity and her character are unimaginable apart from the ways that they've been formed by the physical, emotional, and social challenges of her disability. And this is an insight that's been taken up and developed by subsequent disability theologians. And today I'll just concentrate on two as in some ways exemplary, Deborah Creamer and then Thomas Reynolds. So Deborah Creamer studied and now works at the Iliff School of Theology in Denver, Colorado. She identifies as someone who experiences physical disability, albeit in ways that are more ambiguous and less visible than some other forms of disability. In her 2008 book that I've got on the PowerPoint here, she draws on her own experiences and engages wider scholarship to develop what she calls a model of limits to understand and respond to disability. So by approaching the complex realities of disability through this language of limits, Creamer acknowledges, but also attempts to move beyond preceding medical and social ways of thinking about disability, or the medical and social models of disability. So on the one hand, Creamer largely agrees with critiques of the medical model of disability, whereby disability is simply construed as a bodily or cognitive defect possessed by an individual. Something that we need to go in and solve through medicine. She agrees with disability scholars and activists who have instead proposed a social model, one which focuses on how an able-bodied majority stigmatizes and marginalizes persons with cognitive and physical differences or impairments. So Creamer agrees with that, but she also worries that the social model of disability by itself is insufficient. She worries that this model, by emphasizing minority group status and similarities between persons with disabilities, ignores, quote, the sometimes negative bodily experiences of people with disabilities. That is, the ways in which the medical model, for all its limitations, more clearly drew out. So to reword that, by understanding disability simply in terms of discrimination by an able-bodied majority, her worry is that the social model fails to capture what it really means to be a person with a disability. So central to Creamer's own proposal, or her limits model, is a claim that limits are intrinsic to what it means to be human. Limits, she writes, are a normal and unsurprising aspect of life. So approaching disability and its complexities in this manner, or through this language of limits, allows for attending to bodily limits and impairments as basic to all human experience. As Creamer suggests, key to the limits model is a recognition that disability is actually more normal than any other state of embodiedness. So one advantage of this move, or this turn to language of limits, as Creamer makes clear, is that it avoids the binary language that's implicit in the concept or language of disability, or disability. She explains the concept disabled is inherently related to society's concept of normal. This concept or language disability subtly positions persons with bodily differences negatively with respect to ability or able-bodied. And ultimately, Creamer thinks that the social model is still working within rather than disrupting this logic. So even while it's sort of claiming the identity of disability, it's leaving the logic itself intact. By contrast, Creamer's own limits model draws attention to the more variegated and complex ways in which human beings, including those often classified or described as disabled, the more complex ways in which human beings experience and inhabit the world. The model of limits thus attends to and promotes attention to bodily particularity, to this body or to these bodies, over and against a broader binary division. And furthermore, Creamer's model in this way emphasizes that bodily differences and limits are not inherently or essentially negative. The limits model, she writes, highlights the fact that human limits need not, and perhaps ought not, be seen as negative or as something that is not or that cannot be done. Instead, it claims that limits are an important part of being human. So just to rephrase that, because all human beings have and encounter limits, limits themselves can't be equated with problems. And I think John Swinton's nicely summarised this aspect of Creamer's work when he writes, the limits that emerge from disability are but one instance of the overall limited condition of all human beings. So all human beings experience limits, meaning that disability is but one instance of this wider condition. And finally, before we move on from Creamer, it's worth noting that one of the important insights that she develops in her work is that limits are not only limiting, but also opportunities. As she puts it, rather than acting as a deficit, limits lead us towards creativity and even God. And as she elsewhere summarises, her model explores how limits constitute our self-understanding and our relationality with others. So her concern is with how limits are not only limiting, but provide what she calls constructive possibilities. Embodied limits and constructive possibilities is the subtitle of the book. Possibilities for self-knowledge, for deeper relationships, and for an openness to God. Okay, so let me turn to Thomas Reynolds as another disability theologian that's also pressing into questions of relationality and vulnerability in ways that I think may be helpful for thinking about aging. So Reynolds researches and teaches at Emmanuel College, part of the Toronto School of Theology at the University of Toronto. And his wider work focuses on philosophical theology, interfaith dialogue and engagement, and he's done a good bit of work on Friedrich's Schleiermacher as well. His work on disability draws on these wider interests, as well as his experiences caring for a son with Tourette's and Asperger's syndromes and other behavioural and psychological conditions. So in contrast to Creamer, he's writing from the position of a carer rather than someone experiencing disability in a more direct way. In his 2008 book, Vulnerable Communion, A Theology of Disability and Hospitality, Reynolds presents an approach to disability that has some deep resonances with Creamer's work. And he develops an approach that draws out how vulnerability and relationality are integral to being human and to what it means to be human. Central to his account is a careful analysis of what he calls the cult of normalcy, the complex ways in which we prioritize certain kinds of bodies and minds at the expense of others. And drawing on Michel Foucault, Reynolds attends to the ways in which power is inscribed into bodies through institutions and disciplinary systems, including systems of education, medicine, penal systems, and architecture. The disciplining and normalization of bodies through such systems both displays and produces our cultural assumptions and ideals. And accordingly, the task for theology, as Reynolds summarizes it, is to expose the false social pretenses upon which exclusionary practices towards persons with disabilities are based and which are dehumanizing for all people. And in particular, he identifies this cult of normalcy with our deep-seated cultural ideals of autonomy, self-development, and productivity. So against this exclusionary cult, against the exclusionary logic of this cult, in the ways it devalues certain bodies and minds and privileges others, Reynolds develops an anthropology that more closely attends to what human beings actually are, that is, as relational, independent beings. We are agents defined by the relationships we have with others. And in particular, he suggests that we're defined by relationships of deep vulnerability. And this is the quote on the PowerPoint: "We are at the core exposed to imperilment and suffering, which makes us contingent and incomplete creatures in need of others." In a different context, the critical theorist Judith Butler draws out this basic shared vulnerability, writing, "In its surface and in its depth, the body is a social phenomenon. It's exposed to others, vulnerable by definition." And following Butler, we're open and vulnerable to others in the outside in ways that we can never fully anticipate and control. As with Creamer, for Reynolds, being a limited or vulnerable being is an unsurprising aspect of what it means to be human. To exist as a finite creature, he writes, is to be contingent and vulnerable. In other words, this relational vulnerability is the rule rather than the exception. And acknowledging that this is the case allows for a much more open and honest recognition of what we are, as well as providing a basis for deeper relationships and connections with one another. Finally, Reynolds holds that attending to persons with disabilities can assist us with developing an anthropology along these lines. So this is attending to persons with disabilities can help us better understand who and what we are as human beings. On the one hand, such persons more readily display the kinds of vulnerabilities and dependency that we all share. And they can thus serve as a reminder of the basic human dependence on one another, what Judith Butler calls our shared precariousness. All of us are bound up with others, vulnerable, exposed in ways we can never fully control. On the other hand, attending to such persons helps to unveil and disrupt the cult of normalcy. It helps to disrupt the ways in which we're continually tempted to deny our vulnerability or our creaturely dependence. So it's by embracing and being open to persons with bodies and minds that are different to our own that we begin to contest and overcome this logic of normalcy. And this in turn allows us to better attend to and embrace our own vulnerabilities to the ways in which we are and remain contingent, independent beings. Okay, so I'll just close off with some thoughts on how I think this material from disability theology can provide us with better ways of thinking about aging and specifically moving beyond some of the scripts or narratives as they exist in medicine and gerontology. So first, we've seen that both Creamer and Reynolds clearly affirm that bodily limits and vulnerabilities are unsurprising or basic to what we are as human beings. And by extension, this helps us to recognise that aging and its effects, it helps us to recognise that attempts to avoid aging and its effects, whether by construing aging as a disease or by believing that it can largely be held in check, these attempts are on some level simply misguided. On some level, they're guided by the ideal that it's the younger, productive and autonomous body and mind that is normal. That is, rather than the limited, vulnerable, aging body and mind. Put differently, an idealized version of the white, youthful male body and mind shouldn't be providing the norm for understanding the human being as such. And I think the work in disability theology can help us to recognise that. Furthermore, Creamer and Reynolds help us to recognise that bodily limits and vulnerabilities are never primarily or wholly problematic. At the very least, such limits entail and present opportunities for creativity and for deepening our relationships with one another. And this, again, is an insight that can easily be extended across to aging. Aging and decline similarly require us to be creative in negotiating an increasing limitedness, and recognizing a deepening dependence. At the same time, none of this requires a commitment that aging and decline are simply straightforwardly good, or something that are wholly unproblematic, or something that we should just celebrate and embrace. Creamer, for instance, insists that we should embrace some limits while resisting and struggling to overcome others. And Reynolds recognises that vulnerabilities are often on their own terms tragic, even if they're also necessary for redemption or for deeper and richer relationships. And by extension, this helps us to recognise that ageing and decline, the recognition that ageing and decline are not straightforwardly or wholly good leaves space for managing ageing through medicine, and perhaps also for trying to partially forestall its effects through the pursuit of successful ageing. So, the proposal here is not that we just stop using medicine or gerontology. We need not abandon or eschew these outright. What is needed, however, is a clearer recognition of the limits of such interventions and pursuits, as well as the ways in which these standard scripts can very quickly drift into a subtle denial of the realities of bodily decline and age-related dependence. So if we do continue to make use of medicine and learn from gerontology, and I would suggest that it's a good idea, we need to be clearer about what the limits of these disciplines are with respect to ageing. That is, rather than allowing them to provide our primary language or our most basic scripts for understanding what ageing is. I'll just conclude with one final point, an example to make all this a little more concrete. So in Australia in late 2019, there was an interim report from the Royal Commission of Aged Care Quality and Safety. And the report describes the many problems that older people and their families have in trying to get access to aged care services, service shortfalls, the dispiriting nature of residential care, substandard care and unsafe practice, an underpaid, undervalued and insufficiently trained workforce. So it documents widespread neglect and abuse that's rampant in the residential care for ageing. And I'd suggest that this is downstream from a broader inability to recognise ageing and decline as basic to what human beings are. When ageing bodies and minds, not unlike disabled ones, are implicitly deemed deficient by our standard stories or scripts, then this has real-world consequences. So my suggestion is that a failure to recognise ageing as integral to being human is partly responsible for the neglect and abuse that the Royal Commission uncovered, and which I think is probably rampant in other Western contexts as well. So making limits and vulnerability more central for how we think about ageing may in turn help facilitate better recognition of and care for the ageing and elderly amongst us. Thank you.
Mike, thanks very much indeed. That was excellent, and it's wonderful for the keynotes to end with such a theologically rich paper. I mean, I like very much what you said about theology recognizing and drawing out aging meanings of aging and decline, which perhaps other perspectives and approaches are unable to. So terrific. Thanks ever so much for that. And wonderfully, we also have some time for questions. So if I can just remind folk, there are two ways of putting a question. Either raise your hand through the raise hand facility, or pop your question in the chat, and I'll endeavour to put those directly to Mike.
Peter, I'll perhaps also say I'm aware that this is a heavy paper for towards the end of the conference. I'm very happy to sort of just clarify anything that I moved through a little quickly as well. So happy to talk about anything, but also just just to simply clarify if I need to.
Brilliant. And so, so, comments, requests for clarification, you're open to those as well. Fine. The first question was about whether we could have the slides.
Yeah.
Fine.
I can answer this one. Yes.
Good. Okay. We'll talk afterwards about arranging that. But the first question is from Emily Allen. So, Emily, please.
Hi. Thank you for sharing with us. I don't know if this is taking it in a slightly different direction, but I'm quite interested in the way in which Jesus's humanity informs our own, and particularly his experience of going to the cross and that kind of continued limiting journey, that kind of stripping away, and how models of kind of this Christus Victor that are quite popular in our worship, in our liturgy, in all those kind of things, perhaps are damaging and taking away of that experience of Jesus' humanity and that sense of vulnerability, and how that might better inform our idea of the Christian victory and life that we have, if that makes sense. I know that's a bit rambling.
No, that's excellent. Thank you. And that, so the paper was already too long, so I didn't really have a chance to draw out the sort of theology of the cross that underlies all of this for me. Namely, as Christians, we worship a God who was incarnate and who suffered and died, and that's where God is present and at work. And part of the implication of that is we don't need to fear suffering, or at least we can have hope that this isn't all there is, and that suffering and death doesn't have the final word. And that that allows us to tell the truth. It allows us to sort of live in the midst of things without trying to sort of insulate ourselves from it, or without sort of falling back on these narratives that just don't do justice to how messy and complex it is on the ground. So that, one part of what I'm trying to do here is sort of simply say, we can be a little more honest, and we don't simply need to buy into these wider cultural narratives that, dieting is going to make us live forever. The sort of second aspect of what you mentioned, Emily, is just that sense in which suffering can be stripping away, or something which turns us towards God and others, and perhaps even progressively. And I think that's absolutely the case. So it's how do we sort of say suffering is difficult and perhaps even evil in itself, while also sort of saying there can be a way in which God works through that and presses us back into others. And we need ways of saying both of those things at once. So not simply saying, this is fantastic, I'm aging and dying, and it's making me more dependent on God. And how do we sort of say, this is awful, but also even in the midst of the hardness, we can continue to have hope there. I don't know. It's 10:30 at night, and I'm a morning person, so if I start to drift too much, just interrupt me. But yeah, thanks, Emily. That's great.
Okay, thanks, Emily, and thanks, Mike. Neil has a question in the chat saying, many thanks to you, Mike. How do you think local congregations can be a positive part of shifting these cultures and practices that downplay aging and its realities? Or put differently, how can we be good at aging? I suppose perhaps it's about how to model aging.
I think others here would have others who are more involved in ministry directly would have all sorts of insights. I don't think there's one good way of doing it. I don't think it's the case that we can sort of simply say, I'm no longer going to be part of this wider culture. or I'm no longer going to be affected by, medicine and the ways that it shapes us. I think it's just looking for the cracks, finding those moments of connection that press into something deeper, that allow us to be a bit more authentic with what our experiences are. So I don't think there's, one good way of being aging. I think, some days we'll do it well, some days we'll do it badly. And I think it's just trying to sort of sit a bit closer to that and recognize that it's not, at least ultimately, it's not about whether we can do it well. It's about, who God is and where God is present, and just trying to attend to that, or perhaps, cling to that in the midst of things.
Thanks, Mike. We've got a couple of questions waiting, so I think we'll move on. But thank you for that. So, David Martin, if people could ask their questions concisely, that would be helpful at this point.
I'll try and answer them concisely as well.
Thanks very much, Mike. Can you hear me?
Yeah. I can, yes.
Yeah, okay. Just following on from the way you phrased there about the cracks and everything, it triggered a memory of Leonard Cohen's song, "There's cracks in everything, that's how the light gets in." And I'm wondering sometimes, do we confuse ourselves as evangelicals with our own language? Like we keep praising the cross, and we keep, we refer to being cruciform, taking up our cross and following Jesus Christ. But really, we are ambiguous in that we fear experiences of pain and suffering. And I just notice sometimes the way that people react to documentaries on television and the ads for helping in charities with blindness and things, a revulsion and a recoil that doesn't want to embrace or engage. And I think, the way we even frame it with language, our experiences happen, tsunamis happen, life happens, birth happens, death happens, and we want to be safe or secure and recoil from it. Even verbally, we kind of make it. Sorry, I'm going on too long. I'm just, my question is really about the language that we use to focus our attention, whether it is like positive as engagement or resistance and reluctance to disengage, to participate.
That's excellent. The book that does a really nice job of just sort of laying out some of that fear and revulsion is Fritz de Lange's Loving Old Age, which I mentioned just briefly earlier on, as well as strategies for sort of how we start to see our own aging bodies and those around us differently. Sorry, David, I had something else, but it's slipped my mind.
That's fine, Mike. We've got a couple more questions for you, so we'll move on if that's okay with you. So next to Christine, please.
Hello, thank you, Mike. Hi, it's from Hong Kong. I'm very fascinated by the cross because while disability related to vulnerability, as well as also aging or frailty, like what Elizabeth just mentioned, the inevitability of physical decline, etc., vulnerability is coming. But then it seems that the transcendence, especially related to the cross, the horizontal transcendence and vertical transcendence. Horizontal, I mean connectedness with whole life, with others, particularly in my context, is family and intergenerational love. Because I believe the love and the intimacy is really relating to helping us to transcend the physical pain or suffering, while the vertical transcendence is going back, right, connected with God. And in particular, if the reminiscence and always we talk about in the practice of spiritual care is a lot of NGO also in Hong Kong talk about life meaning and life review, so that we can connect the meaning out of it to transcend all the suffering. What's your view on this?
Thank you, Christine, and it's good to see you again as well. I think I'm just trying to think this through. I get slightly nervous about language of sort of meaning and transcendence in that it can start to stabilize experience, or it can start to, sorry, I'm not putting that very clearly. So I think yes, but I think I'm just also slightly nervous that if we start to think too much about meaning in aging, it can again start to sort of gloss over some of the ways in which it just doesn't make sense, or it doesn't work, or you know, we have those days that you know, we can't sort of find meaning in the midst of things. So I guess I just want a framework that can recognise the value of that without making that a sort of first language or a primary language, in the same ways that I'm nervous about language of successful aging or positive aging or something like that. But yeah, I think, yeah. So that would be the start of an answer on that.
Brilliant. So maybe the cross could help us think about unmeaning.
Yeah, that's right. Good.
And the very last question comes from Nigel. To what extent do you think social media has exacerbated the power of the cult of normalcy? So this is a question to your, perhaps the earlier part of your presentation about, you know, kind of what is normal. To what extent has social media exacerbated this stress on normalcy?
That's excellent. I'm sure that's the case. I'm terrible with technology in general. I do have a Facebook account, but I only opened it about a year ago, and I don't really know how to use it very well. And my kids are just still not quite old enough to be really impacted by some of this. All of which is to say, I don't have any sort of direct wisdom or insight. I'm sure at a general level, this is exacerbating, you know, trends that were happening already. Yeah, and just the, you know, the kinds of pressures that you know, run through high schools and places like that.
Mike, thanks ever so much. We've come to the end of our time, I'm afraid, but I just wanted to thank you for, you know, that contribution, you know, both the substantive contribution and your engagement with the questions and comments at the end. It's been a real pleasure having you, and it's been wonderful to kind of conclude on this kind of sustained theological engagement with our topic. I mean, that's just been terrific, outstanding, and we're very grateful for your contribution to the conference